The city of Statesboro woke to rain that morning, and with it, the kind of silence that means something's gone terribly wrong. By noon, the city prosecutor's wife had vanished. Her phone, dead. Her car, abandoned in the parking lot of her own office building. And the man who should have been tearing the city apart searching for her wasn't even worried. He sat in his office that afternoon, reviewing case files like it was just another Tuesday. But when detectives entered her office later that evening, what they found inside turned this missing persons case into one of the most disturbing scandals the city had ever seen. This is the story of Delilah Price, a woman whose disappearance would expose the darkness hiding behind one of Statesboro's most respected families. Delilah Price was 38 years old when she disappeared. To most people in Statesboro, she was simply the prosecutor's wife, the woman who smiled politely at fundraisers and stood quietly beside her husband during press conferences. But Delilah was so much more than that. She ran a small nonprofit that helped women transitioning out of homelessness, worked there 6 days a week, and knew the name of every person who walked through her doors. Her assistant, Maria, would later tell detectives that Delilah had this way of making you feel seen, like your story mattered, like you mattered. She was the kind of person who remembered your birthday, who'd bring you soup when you were sick, who'd stay late to help you fill out housing applications even when she was exhausted, and she was exhausted often. Those who knew her well saw the tiredness in her eyes, the way her smile sometimes didn't quite reach them anymore. Her husband, Leonard Price, was Statesboro's star prosecutor, the man who'd put away dozens of criminals, who spoke at schools about justice and integrity, who was being talked about as a future judge, maybe even attorney general. They'd been married for 15 years, had met when Delilah was volunteering at a legal aid clinic where Leonard was doing pro bono work. Everyone said they were the perfect couple. But perfection, as Detective Marcus Fremont knew too well, was often just a carefully maintained illusion. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Detective Fremont got the call about Delilah's disappearance at 2:15 in the afternoon. He was 53 years old, 28 years on the force, and he'd worked enough missing person cases to know that the first 24 hours were critical. He also knew Leonard Price had testified in several of his cases and had always found the man to be cold, calculated, almost mechanical in his precision. When Fremont arrived at the Price home that afternoon, Leonard was on his laptop at the kitchen table, not pacing, not making frantic phone calls, just working. Fremont asked him when he'd last seen his wife, and Leonard said yesterday morning that she'd left for work around 7:30 like always, that he'd worked late and assumed she'd gone to bed when he got home around 11. He hadn't checked her side of the bed, apparently. Hadn't noticed she never came home. When Fremont asked if that was unusual, Leonard had shrugged and said, Delilah sometimes stayed late at the office or crashed at Maria's place when she was working on grant applications. His tone was flat, almost bored. Fremont felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen grief before, seen panic and fear and desperation, and this wasn't it. This was something else entirely. By evening, they'd located Delilah's car in the nonprofit's parking lot, driver's side door unlocked, her purse still on the passenger seat, phone inside but powered off. The office building had cameras, but the footage from the previous night was missing, the hard drive corrupted according to the building's security company. Convenient. Too convenient. When Fremont and his partner entered Delilah's office, they found her desk neat, organized, everything in its place except for one thing. Her computer was on, screen dark but humming, and when they woke it up they found a document open. It was titled, In Case Something Happens to Me, and it was dated 3 weeks earlier. The document was 7 pages long, and every word felt like a punch to the gut. Delilah had been afraid. Not of some stranger, not of a random threat, but of her own husband. She wrote about how Leonard had changed over the past 2 years, how the ambition that had once been admirable had twisted into something darker, something obsessive. He'd started working with developers who wanted to buy up properties in the poorest parts of Statesboro, areas where Delilah's nonprofit operated, where the people she helped lived. She'd overheard phone conversations, seen documents she wasn't supposed to see, and realized Leonard wasn't just prosecuting criminals anymore. He was protecting certain ones, the ones with money and connections, the ones who could help him climb higher. When she confronted him about it 6 months ago, he'd looked at her with eyes she didn't recognize and told her to stay out of his business. 2 weeks after that conversation, she'd been followed home from work by a car with tinted windows. A month later, someone broke into the nonprofit office but didn't steal anything, just left everything slightly disturbed, like a warning. And 3 weeks before she disappeared, Leonard had asked her about her life insurance policy, about whether she'd updated the beneficiary information recently, and the way he asked it, casual over breakfast like he was asking about the weather, had made her blood run cold. She wrote that she was documenting everything, keeping copies of Leonard's files, recording conversations, and that if anything happened to her, people needed to know it wasn't an accident. Fremont read the document 3 times, each time feeling angrier, sicker. He'd worked with Leonard Price for years, had respected him, and all along the man had been exactly the kind of criminal he claimed to fight. But here was the problem. A document wasn't proof, fear wasn't evidence, and without a body, without witnesses, without something concrete, all they had was the word of a missing woman against one of the most powerful lawyers in the city. Maria, Delilah's assistant, was 26 years old and had known Delilah for 3 years. When Fremont interviewed her, she was shaking, crying, saying over and over that she should have done something, should have said something sooner. She told him that Delilah had been scared for months, that she'd started parking in different spots every day, changing her routine, looking over her shoulder. 2 weeks before she disappeared, Delilah had given Maria a key to a storage unit across town and made her promise that if anything happened, she'd give it to the police. Maria led Fremont to the storage facility that night, a rundown place on the edge of town, and inside Unit 217 they found boxes. Dozens of boxes filled with documents, USB drives, folders labeled with dates and names. Delilah had been building a case against her own husband. The files detailed everything: bribes Leonard had taken from developers, cases he'd deliberately tanked to protect wealthy defendants, threats he'd made to witnesses. And in one folder marked personal, they found something that changed everything. Photos, dozens of them. Delilah with bruises on her arms, a black eye poorly covered with makeup, fingerprints on her throat. Medical records from urgent care visits where she'd claimed she fell, walked into a door, slipped on stairs. All the classic excuses, all the classic lies that abused victims tell because they're terrified or ashamed or still holding on to hope that the person they loved is still in there somewhere. The most recent photo was dated 4 days before her disappearance. In it, Delilah's lip was split, and she was staring directly at the camera with eyes that held no more hope, only resignation and a quiet, determined fury. On the back, she'd written in shaky handwriting, "He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I disappeared and no one would ever find me." Armed with Delilah's evidence, Fremont got a warrant to search the Price home. Leonard was calm during the search, too calm, standing in his living room with his arms crossed while officers tore through his house. They found Leonard's home office locked, and when they broke through, they discovered a safe hidden behind a bookshelf. Inside were more documents, financial records showing payments to the same developers Delilah had documented, along with something unexpected: a burner phone. The text messages on it painted a clear picture. Leonard had been having an affair with a woman named Jessica, a paralegal in the district attorney's office, and 3 months ago he'd told her he was going to leave Delilah. But then Delilah had found out about his corruption, and Leonard's texts to Jessica became increasingly frantic. He couldn't divorce Delilah now, not when she could destroy his career, his reputation, everything he'd built. In a text dated 1 week before Delilah's disappearance, Leonard had written to Jessica, "I'm handling it. Trust me, By next month, we won't have to hide anymore." Jessica had responded, "What are you going to do?" Leonard's reply was chilling in its simplicity, "Whatever it takes." But here's where the story takes a turn that no one, not even Fremont with all his years of experience, saw coming. When they brought Leonard in for questioning, he didn't lawyer up immediately. Instead, he sat across from Fremont in the interrogation room and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a guilty smile, a satisfied one. And then he said something that made Fremont's blood run cold. "You think you figured it out. You think I killed her. But you're wrong, Detective. I didn't kill Delilah." He leaned forward, that smile never wavering. "She killed herself." Leonard's story was this. Delilah had been unstable for years, depressed, paranoid, making up stories about him to justify her own mental deterioration. The bruises were from her hurting herself, trying to frame him. The files she'd collected were delusions, misinterpretations, the desperate constructions of a woman losing her grip on reality. And the night she disappeared, she called him from her office, crying, saying she couldn't do it anymore, that she was going to end things. He claimed he tried to talk her down, but she hung up. He said he was so used to her dramatic episodes that he didn't think she'd actually do anything, which is why he didn't report her missing immediately. It was a good story. A careful story. Exactly the kind of story a prosecutor would construct. But Fremont didn't believe a word of it. The problem was proving it. Without a body, they couldn't charge him with murder. And Leonard knew it. He sat in that interrogation room for 6 hours, never wavering, never slipping, always in complete control. They had to let him go. But Fremont wasn't done. He went back to the storage unit, went through every box again, and in the very last one, at the bottom beneath folders and binders, he found a small digital recorder. Delilah's voice came through the speaker, quiet but clear, and she was talking to herself, documenting, making a record. The recording was from the night she disappeared. She was in her office, and she was saying that Leonard had called her, told her he was coming to talk, that they needed to figure things out. She sounded scared but hopeful, like maybe finally they could find a way through this. Then there were footsteps, Leonard's voice. "Delilah, we need to talk about these files you've been keeping." And Delilah's response, shaky but firm, "I'm not giving them to you, Leonard. I'm giving them to the police." What happened next was captured in terrible, crystal clarity. The sound of a struggle, Delilah screaming, objects crashing, and then silence, heavy breathing. Leonard's voice, cold and emotionless, saying to himself, "It's done. Call it in tomorrow. Make it look like she ran." The recorder kept running for another 20 minutes, capturing the sounds of Leonard cleaning up, moving things, and then nothing. The recorder had been in Delilah's pocket, had fallen out during the struggle, had rolled under her desk where Leonard didn't see it. She'd been wearing it as insurance. It had kept recording until the battery died hours later. With the recording, they had everything they needed. Leonard Price was arrested the next morning at his office, and this time there was no calm composure, no satisfied smile. He knew it was over. They found Delilah's body 2 days later. Leonard had buried her in a construction site, one of the development projects he'd been protecting, in a spot that was scheduled to be paved over with concrete the following week. She would have been gone forever if not for her own foresight, her own courage in documenting everything, in leaving a trail for someone to follow. The trial lasted 3 months. The evidence was overwhelming. Leonard Price was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Jessica, the paralegal, was charged as an accessory after the fact. The developers Leonard had been protecting went down too, caught up in the corruption scandal that Delilah's files revealed. Delilah's nonprofit continues today, renamed the Delilah Price Center for Women's Advocacy, run by Maria, and funded by donations that poured in from across the country after her story went public. Her story became a rallying cry, a reminder that domestic violence doesn't discriminate, that it can hide behind success and respectability, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one sleeping beside you. Detective Fremont retired 6 months after the trial. He said he'd seen enough, done enough, and that Delilah's case would be the one he'd never forget. Not because of the investigation, not because of the conviction, but because of how close Leonard came to getting away with it. Because if Delilah hadn't been so brave, so prepared, so determined that her voice would be heard even if she couldn't speak it herself, her husband would have gotten away with murder. Think about that for a moment. Think about Delilah, knowing she was in danger, documenting everything, leaving a trail, fighting for justice even as she faced the possibility that she might not survive to see it. Think about how many women live in that same fear, trapped by someone they once loved, someone who's supposed to protect them. How would you feel if this was someone you loved? What would you do if you saw the signs? Delilah's story ended in tragedy, but it also ended with truth, with justice, with her voice finally being heard. And sometimes, that's all we can hope for. That even in the darkest circumstances, the truth finds a way to come out. That courage, even in the face of evil, means something. That a life, even one cut short, can leave a legacy that changes the world. Delilah Price was 38 years old. She was a daughter, a friend, an advocate for those who had no voice. And she deserves to be remembered not as a victim, but as a fighter who made sure that the truth would never be buried, no matter what her husband tried to do.